I lived in Columbia, South Carolina for a while. The Confederate flag flew over the state capitol building. It's still flying over the state capitol in Mississippi. That stuff is still there. People will say it's heritage, not hate, but that's ridiculous.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
Tell us a little bit about Varina Davis, the person you discovered, and why you took an interest in this figure from history.
Well, I didn't want to write about the Civil War again. I really thought, never again for that material. I'm done with it. But I was already working on a different idea for a book, and read that she, shortly after her husband Jefferson Davis died, they were living in Biloxi, Mississippi, that she, at age 60, packed up her bags and moved to New York City to become a writer. Now that seemed surprising to me for Jefferson Davis's wife, and she did that. She earned part of her living writing for New York newspapers for quite a few years. Then I found out that in New York, she became friends with Julia Grant, yeah. Ulysses S. Grant's widow, and that they would go have lunches together, take carriage rides in Central Park. They wanted to be seen. They genuinely liked each other and went on vacations together, but they wanted to be seen as a representation of reconciliation for the country. So I thought this is a woman worth knowing something about.
At that stage, you simply knew her name and these biographical details of her life many years after the end of the Civil War and the end of the brief Confederacy of the United States and all that. So then you started to read about her, and you discovered her to be, I suspect, some variation on this extraordinarily interesting person in this book. Was it her own writing? Was it other people's writing? Was it some combination? How did she come together in your imagination?
Well, when her husband died, he had just started a memoir. And before she left Mississippi, she finished it for him. It has a little bit of a feeling of being slapped together. But the pieces that just stand out very brightly are her writing about her childhood, her teenage years, that she kind of salts in.
Not credited. It's still in his voice.
It's, I've forgotten the exact title, but it's something like The Memoir of Jefferson Davis by Varina Davis.
Okay, so it's really...
And the bits of writing were beautiful, and I found people who knew her. She was, I think, maybe still 17 the first time she went to Washington as the wife of a member of the House of Representatives. And she was considered always one of the smartest, wittiest, best educated women or men in the room. She could be intimidating, she could be annoying. People thought she was too much of those things. All the way through her life, people thought she was too much of those things. She says at some point that at 17, when she met Jefferson Davis, she wasn't very desirable as a partner because she was too tall, too smart, too educated, too opinionated, too dark-skinned. And all of those things were criticized about her in Richmond during the Civil War.
And she was a formidable person.
Yeah.
And this is something I want to explore a little more because it's so essential to the book, she was simultaneously highly aware of the appalling reality of the world around her, the world at which she was ostensibly a leading member of for the society, but also not comfortable with it, but resigned to it. that complexity interested you.
Yeah, I didn't see her as a hero when I started reading about her, when I started working on the book, and I didn't see her that way when I finished the book. What I was interested in is that in her 60s and 70s and into her early 80s, she was thinking, she was changing. She never got to a position on race and the aftermath of slavery that any of us would be comfortable with. But in the South, the people that she had grown up with, the people that she had known in Washington and in Richmond, were developing that mythology of the lost cause. They were digging their heels into the nostalgia of their youth, finding that golden era that was lost, and refusing to acknowledge what that golden era was based on, the ownership of human beings. She was still struggling with those ideas, trying to understand some of her complicity in that. And that's what I liked, is a person at that age not going back to youthful nostalgia, trying to live in the world they're living in right that moment and to understand their place in it. And as I said, none of us could be comfortable with the place she got to before she died, but I was very interested in the attempt.
An extraordinary frame to the novel, and this is her meeting up again with Jimmy Limber.
Yeah.
Now James Blake, is that right?
Yeah.
For those who haven't read it, the novel is framed, and the sort of structural through line are these series of conversations she has, Varina has in 1906, is that right, Charles? Yeah. With a late middle-aged African-American who has found her in a sanatorium in Saratoga Springs, where she's trying to dry out after a lifelong addiction to opium, yeah, which we can come back to. And this a man, it turns out, was a young boy whom she took off the streets of Richmond and raised until they were separated by the catastrophe, the falling apart of things at the end of the war. Yeah. Tell me the reason for that frame and what it allowed you to do in terms of stretching the narrative and in a sense encompassing more of American history and more of the sort of fallout or the continuation of that conversation, those terrible conversations that emerged from the war.
Yeah. Well, the Jimmy Limber character, the child, he would have been about 5 or 6.
This is true too, right?
True.
There are photos of this boy.
It was one of those things I found early on. A picture, you can just Google Jimmy Limber and you'll see this this boy who is, like I said, about 6, give or take. He's dressed in a fancy little suit and he's standing next to a fancy chair, and it was taken during a photographic session with her family, and this child was there and was living in the nursery with Jefferson Davis's children. Now, whether the story is that she saw him being beaten on the streets of Richmond, driving by in a carriage, and got him into the carriage and took him home with her, which has a little bit of that white savior feel to me. I think it's at least as likely that her little boys, Varina's little boys, who were just little wild men, they were part of a street gang in Richmond, that they knew this kid from the streets and knew that he didn't really have a home and brought him home with them, and she said, "Oh, well, just let him stay." He was with them all through the escape from Richmond before the fall of Richmond. They were fleeing to try to get to Havana, to get to Florida and then get a boat to Havana. And Jimmy Limber, which was his nickname because he was double-jointed, he was there. He was taken from her when they were captured by federal troops. And then a year or two later, he disappears from history. So I wrote the first year of the book thinking, I like this little boy, I like him in the book. And then I kept thinking, what might have happened to him after he falls out of history? So I just thought, well, I'll invent a life for this person. I'll think about what could have happened to him. The last known contact he had was a woman from Boston who was down in South Carolina teaching the children of liberated slaves, and she may have taken him back to Boston with her. So I invented a life based on that one little hint. And he goes to this hotel in Saratoga Springs, and says, "Am I that child?"
Right, because he can't quite recall naturally.
Yeah.
He's only 5 or 6.
Yeah, he has weird memories of, fancy dress balls and dinners, and doesn't know where they came from, but he thinks it might be there. And so they, over the course of 7 Sundays, they talk about his memories and her memories, and he gets bolder as the book goes along in asking her pointed questions about her relationship to race and slavery.
Now, Charles, that figure, the grown James, in 1906, could have been a much more, and many authors might be inclined to make him much more of an interrogator.
Yeah.
But you posit or position the relationship much more subtly or gently, I feel. Was that deliberate, or is that just your inclination as a writer? I mean,
well, in 1906, Varina had 6 children. Only one was still alive. Only one of her children lived long enough to reproduce, and that child was living in Colorado. So I saw her as a childless mother and him as a motherless
Right.
child, and that the basis of this relationship that they're developing over these few weeks has that at the core of it, that he has these memories of a motherly figure that he's trying to understand his feelings toward those memories and his feelings toward the real person behind those memories.
and to some extent, that casting of their relationship as you just described, motherless child, childless mother, is similar to the way you approach almost all the relationships between people in the book, even if they're profoundly unequal or based on profound inequalities and injustices. I noticed that your work, and this is true of the early books as well, you resist villainizing. At least it seems to me.
Well, I've got some fairly cutthroat villains through the years, but
I guess the major characters.
The major
Yes,
characters.
yes.
Yeah, I always want to find some humanity and some core of kindness in. I mean, if a character doesn't have some kind of core of humanity and kindness, I don't want to spend that much time with them. A really bad guy I can have fun writing about for a little while, but yeah, I want some humanity in the people I'm going to be stuck with for 4 years.
Is there somewhere in there an argument about the complicity of humans in all structures that are around them?
Well, I think maybe what I was thinking about is the insistence on some people of finding humanity even in inhuman circumstances. That within the historical structure that that allowed for a relationship like they had, that there was room for, that they made room for some genuine human emotion toward each other, even if even if they are suspicious of it or if he's suspicious of it, that there is some level of generosity and kindness, I think, in James Blake's adult reaction to her.
There is indeed. Matter of fact, I think there's great extended kindness throughout the book, despite the harrowing circumstances of much of it. Varina herself is simultaneously a victimizer, but also a victim as a woman in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Was that always a sort of operating principle for her character in the book?
Yeah, I mean, discovering that, this woman who was at dinner parties in Washington before the war, she was always, better educated, smarter, better read, all of those things than most of the men in the room. When she was 17, she was at a party with the Vice President of the United States, a noted scientist at the time, some other famous writer at the time, and she wrote about it in a letter to her mother, and she said, well, she tried to hold up her end of that, and that though the men were maybe fishing in shallow waters, that she felt pretty good about how she comported herself during that conversation.
Did the oddity, or not oddity, did the dynamics of her relationship with Jefferson Davis, he was twice her age, he was a widower, he was a remote, aloof man, somewhat taciturn. Did that interest you to try and I assume this was entirely, mostly imaginable, maybe you had some writings to go on, to try and understand how they fit together or didn't fit together, because it was actually a romance that functioned best when apart, wasn't it?
Yeah.
As they were, because they were separated for much of their lives because he was in prison and they were floating in different spaces, weren't they?
Yeah. Well, I was interested in the difficulty of the marriage, the age discrepancy, that he was not as interested in art and literature and all that as she was, and his coldness. That Sam Houston was in the U.S. Senate with Jefferson Davis, and they didn't particularly like each other. And Houston said, Jefferson Davis is cold as a lizard and ambitious as Lucifer. And I tried to I kept that little thing in my mind all the time, writing about him. I didn't want to write about Jefferson Davis much, not interested in him very much. What I was interested in was the times they were apart. She was in London by herself a good bit after the war, and there's a letter that I used and adapted a little bit. But the part that's in her real letter, she writes, "Stay away from me until the fall, and then we'll see if there's anything left." And that seemed like a remarkable thing for a first lady of a fake nation to have written to the guy who was the fake president of the fake nation.
Towards the end of the book, you quote her, and you can tell me if you made this up or if it's actually Varina Davis, her saying, "How I wish my husband had been a dry goods clerk."
Yeah.
Do you think that's true?
That's word for word. Yeah.
But do you think it's true?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think at that moment she thought it was true. Because she, as secession was beginning to build in the United States, she had a reputation for being able to foresee the future.
Oh, her dreams, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very vivid.
She never claimed she had that power, but her friends did. And she told Mary Chestnut, one of her friends in Washington and later in Richmond, "I know what's going to happen. The South is going to secede, and my husband will be made president, and it will be a disaster for everyone." And she wanted to stay in Washington. Her ambition was not to be First Lady of the Confederacy. It was to be First Lady of the United States of America and live in the White House and have great dinners with smart people sitting around a dinner table having conversations.
Was that not always delusional?
Well, no, he was, he was an authentic
Was he a player?
American military
Yes,
hero.
the Mexican War.
In the
yes.
Mexican War,
Yeah.
yeah. And he had been in the House of Representatives, the Senate, he had been Secretary of War. So the progression of his political career could logically have led to the White House.
Okay. Let's frame the book a little more. Jefferson Davis, many of the statues of Davis that have come down in the last few years went up around the time of the frame of the novel. Jim Crow,
Yeah.
early 1900s. How was that for you working? You writers can't help but have hindsight, obviously. You're framing this story a century after, and you're framing it, and I know the book was written over a period of years, but you're framing it during a very vigorous interrogation of these patterns. How did that inform Varina, the novel?
Well, I've been working on this. I worked on this for the past 5 years, and during that time, all of that was going on. And every day, I'd sit down at my desk with some new thing to think about, and I think it was enormously helpful to me in shaping my feelings about those things, and in letting those feelings find a place in the book that.
Can you give me an example?
Well, when you grow up in the South at the time I did, or even more recently than that, the Confederate flag is very much a presence in your life. I won't say every day, but frequently. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina for a while. The Confederate flag flew over the state capitol building. It's still flying over the state capitol in Mississippi. That stuff is still there. People will say it's heritage, not hate, but that's ridiculous. It's a symbol that needed to have gone away a long time ago. And all those statues of people like Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, those people certainly do not belong on public lands. They put them in a museum, but not on public property. And that's, the Jefferson Davis statue in Memphis was it was a very clever thing. There's a state law in Tennessee that a city cannot take down a public statue on public land. So what they did in Memphis was they sold that land to a private entity for 24 hours, took the statue down, and then the city bought the land back. So I thought that was and then the legislature in Tennessee is intent on punishing.
How
Memphis for that.
woven into the character of the South of both the end of, say, Varina Davis's life, of your childhood, possibly to some extent now, how woven into the fabric of Southern life is a deep humility about the complexity of the experience? Because what you just described is a torturous process. And it's a torturous process over not just decades, but now centuries.
Yeah. I think in the South still, for a big chunk of people, it is a torturous process to understand the history of the culture you grew up in. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, it's not torturous. This is our heritage. Shut up about it.
Right.
But go back to Faulkner. He was turning that stuff over and over and over, trying to understand it. It's been part of Southern literature for a long time to try to understand what our culture did. One of the things I kept thinking about when I was working on this book, there's a Uruguayan writer whose name has just slipped my mind, but he writes a lot about history, and he does some fiction too.
Galeano? No. Eduardo Galeano, is that right?
I think that's it. I think that's
yeah.
it. Who said, history never says goodbye. History says see you later. And at home, over the past 4 or 5 years, when you think about, I was at the spot in South Georgia where Jefferson Davis was captured on the day of those horrible church shootings in Charleston. The violence in Charlottesville, those white supremacist riots, all the arguments about the monuments and the flags and the Confederate iconography, all of that was right there in front of me all the way through working on this book, and I was trying to give it a place and to feel that what I was seeing around me as I wrote this book was that see you later moment, that we have yet to resolve the issues that caused that war all this time later, and we're still living with the consequences of that failure to deal with that.
Do you think a writer from another part of the United States, say the North or the West, would have said, as Faulkner famously said, past isn't dead, it isn't even the past? Do you think it's a particular obligations burden for a Southern writer to negotiate that constantly?
Well, I don't know. I think, this just may be generalizations, but a lot of the people I know from, say, the North in the United States, you ask them about their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, they only go back a generation or two in their memories. Most of the people I know can just go down the list. There's a little Unitarian Universalist church in Western North Carolina that my great-great-great-grandfather built when he came home from the Civil War. I can go to that little church and see a picture of him. So that I think the past feels closer in some ways.
Is there also maybe at the same time a risk of fetishizing that obsession with the past?
Absolutely, yeah. All the Stonewall Jackson fetishizing, all of that. There's this will give you a sense of how strong some of that is. In Lexington, Virginia, there in a cemetery right in town, there's a gravestone that is for Stonewall Jackson's arm.
Arm?
Yeah, that got shot off. So
that's
like
healthy.
like a shrine.
Yes. Okay. You write so, not just beautifully, but with such obvious ardor about Southern landscapes. The flora, the fauna, the rivers, everything. How almost involuntary is that in your prose?
Well, I'm sure it is. It's what I know.
Could you imagine
maybe
yourself
the best.
writing postcard fiction, a flash fiction like your daughter?
Fiction. Oh.
Like, in other words, because it is like, as you said earlier, like when we were joking before, I'd love to write a short novel, but, then I wouldn't be able to describe stuff. So,
yeah.
It feels to me to be indelibly bound up with your vision.
Well, I grew up in the Southern Appalachians in a little tiny town surrounded by mountains. It was like a bowl. The town was in a little valley, and it was just ringed by mountains that were 6,000 feet tall. And I was a sort of a free-range child, and I spent a whole lot of time in the woods and riding my bike on back roads, and I still do that. That's how I spend 5 days a week when I'm in Western North Carolina, is out in the woods for at least 2 or 3 hours. It's the continuity of my life, and it's there. That cliche, write what you know. Well, I kind of know that, and it comes out.
Before we open it up to the audience, I want to do two things. I'd like to pivot into very contemporary moment, citing your book, but also we discussed maybe you'd like to give people a one-page or so feeling for the prose, which is so beautiful. Are you still happy to do that, or do you want?
Sure. Yeah. Let
okay.
me.
Charles is gonna read
Let me read this just a little bit. This bit happens when after the war, Jefferson Davis is in prison. The U.S. government was going to try him for treason with the idea of hanging him. They ended up losing their nerve and letting him go. And when they let him go, he came to Montreal and stayed in a hotel for a while. I pointed that way like that's where Montreal is. That
Which way is Montreal, everybody? That way? Okay. Close.
Montreal. So he's in prison on the Chesapeake Bay at a place, there's a Fortress Monroe, and it's on Old Point Pleasant, which ironically is the exact spot that the first black slaves were unloaded from a Portuguese ship in the United States. So he's there in prison. And she's staying there, but she can come and go. And she's been out on the beach at an oyster roast. And she thinks maybe she'll take a few fried oysters out to back into the fort for him. V said, "Would you have a dozen of those to spare? I know he would like a few." Moments later, she hurried back through the sally port with a napkin bundle of them, hot and greasy, 8 to give to Jeff before they went completely cold, and 2 each for the young guards at the gate who appreciated her treats of candy or pastries and welcomed her comings and goings. She always had something for them, even if only a hard peppermint. The heavy cannons of the ramparts and the water battery almost disappeared in the dark. 2 boys at the gate, young enough to be her sons if she'd had children right after her marriage, ate their oysters in gulps, and one of them slightly groaned at the pleasure of it. He raised his fingertips to his face and breathed in the salt sea of the oysters and the earth of bacon and bacon grease on his skin. He reminded V of those thousands of young dying men in the hospitals of Richmond, Northern boys and Southerners, blown apart by war, lying swaddled in bloody bandages, their limbs and the features of their faces blasted away. How difficult on her daily visits not to tell them to go right ahead and die at that very moment of young life while still ruled by a rising tide of emotions. Those same emotions old cynical politicians and businessmen and army officers used against them to convince them to fight and die. Hard not to hold their chilly hands with ragged, dirty nails and push the long hair back and kiss their weary, sweaty brows and say, "Don't wait. Do it now, not decades later, when every throb of feeling ebbs, every action and choice becomes tinged with regret and harsh judgment, a sense of waste and loss and emptiness, life narrowing down to little more than an endless railway tunnel. Let go, son. It'll be all right. Take one deep breath and then just rise from this bad place and from your broken body and keep going. I'll sit here with you and hold your hand until you've made it past the bend in the road and into the green woods." And truthfully, one time she couldn't help but actually say it. She whispered into the boy's ear like a sweetheart, "Walk into the big green woods. I'll wait here and watch until you're gone." She said it hardly louder than a sigh, and like a magic spell, the boy died right then. Holding his hand, she could feel life go the lifting of the spirit, a sudden lightness. And then that young man, blown apart by the sorry war, became young forever.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to open it up to the audience in a minute, but just before that, Charles, and you're under no obligation to engage with me on this, but I couldn't help but think about a sentence in the context of the last couple of years, and even context of last night, and even the context of a press conference given today at 12 o'clock, where Varina says to someone in this novel, "In case you haven't noticed, we are a furious nation, and war drums beat in our chest. Our leaders proclaim better than they negotiate. The only bright spot is the right side won." Now that's 18. She's talking about the Civil War. Is America a furious nation?
It certainly seems like it a lot of the time to me. And if any of you saw that press conference you're referring to, that certainly had fury at its core. Yeah, that's kind of the way it feels down there right now. So yeah.
So Varina is not a Civil War novel, but is it in your mind I know it's not a Civil War novel because you don't want it to be thought of, and it really is aftermath. Is it a contemporary novel? Is this a novel about contemporary concerns and anxieties?
Well, I always feel like with historical fiction that it's always at least as much about the time the author is living in as the time that it's set in. At least the stuff that I think of as the good literary historical fiction. I mean, Scarlet Letter in a lot of ways always feels like it's more about the time Hawthorne was living than the time the Puritans were around. So I think I don't really try to keep that contemporary stuff out of the book.
You just think it's going to happen because
yeah.
you are alive now.
Yeah.
And you are, after you write and walk in the woods, and then maybe you watch some CNN, and it all kind of balances out.
Well, and the review of Cold Mountain that I treasure more than any other was from Willie Morris, who was a wonderful writer and a critic.
Southern gentleman as well, is he not?
And he said Cold Mountain is very deeply a contemporary novel, and I thought, okay, well he got what I think I was trying to do to some extent.